Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional people of this land. In this place would be the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation. I'm a social ecologist, so I want to speak from that perspective. And I've actually written out a talk. I don't usually do that, but I thought for this occasion I wanted to make some points. So I'll begin with my own personal story, which is one that social ecology looks at from the point of view of a sense of place, a sense of personal connection. And then from there I'll look at the bigger picture of Australia and then the even bigger picture of Europe, North America and the contemporary world. So I've approached the whole question of the rise of hatred in the Western world, as I say, from a social ecology perspective. And I'll consider the topic both from a cultural and an ecological perspective, which I call an ecology of culture. The idea of an ecology of culture arose from my own doctoral research in social ecology that examined the use of drama education for anti-racism work with teachers, youth workers and youth. And I'll say more about that later. However, I suspect that the phenomenon of racism so prevalent in Australian society is a major factor of the self-hatred that we are talking about today. It was my experience of growing up in Australia that drew me to this topic of racism, as I perceived it in my growing up here in the 50s and 60s, and then when I became a chemical engineer in the late 60s. So as a chemical engineer, I saw myself, and I guess I still see myself, as a product of the Western world. I grew up at a time when science and technology were presented as the saviour of humanity. This remarkable product of the Western world certainly has much to contribute to humanity, and one would think that any civilization that has achieved such progress in this domain has much to commend it. However, it is the same civilization that has taken the world to the brink of ecological collapse. Indeed, many scientists today are now saying that we have a window of some 20 to 30 years to reverse the situation before we experience a global catastrophe. Vandana Shiva, the physicist and ecofeminist, says that the World War, the Third World War, is a war against nature. I heard her speak at the Opera House a few years ago when she won the Sydney Peace Prize. A remarkable woman. And to me, as a victim of the Second World War, I resonated with her statement. As a child born to a Jewish family in Romania just after that terrible war, I grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust and the atomic bomb. With the coming of communism to Romania, my parents decided that this was the last straw, so they travelled west, clearly hoping for a better future for themselves and their offspring. They ended up in Vienna for a couple of years, but that city, for all its great culture, proved a serious health hazard to me as a child due to its dampness and pollution. I now realise I was suffering from an environmental illness in Vienna in the late 40s. As it happened, we ended up in Australia, which is geographically not part of the Western world, its very name coming from the Latin of the Great South Land, Terra Australis. Growing up in Australia, I was told that I was part of the Western world, even if we are in the southeast. Furthermore, Australia was considered a prime example of the success of the Western world in its creation of a lucky country. I was educated in Western culture, both in the sciences and the arts. As I grew up playing the violin, passing my exams at New South Wales Conservatorium of Music, just down the road here, with honours, so much so that I wanted to be an orchestral conductor. It was here that I encountered my first serious disruption in my understanding of what is valued in the Western world. Music, it seems, was not considered a suitable career, so chemical engineering was the direction my life took. So while Western classical music was one of the great products of Western civilization, it was not encouraged as a career by my parents, also then products of the Western world, who saw science and technology as the proper direction for me to take. Inadvertently, I then realised I was a victim of another war, the war between the humanities and the sciences that has beleaguered the Western world, as the author C.P. Snow described it in a lecture he gave in the 1950s. Here we have another reason, I would argue, for this self-hatred of the Western world, which on the one hand celebrates the great achievements of art, and all the other, on the other hand, disregards or even disdains the artists who produce it. The third element of my Western upbringing was my religion. In Western democracies, I was led to believe that religion is a private matter and in no way impacts on one's civil society. However, anti-Semitism, also a product of the Western world, has been present since Roman times. In pre-15th century Spain, the Eastern rulers, the Moors, created a society where Jews, Muslims and Christians were able to live together harmoniously. Then, with the coming of the Christian Western rulers, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the Jews were expelled from Spain, along with the Muslims. This was the time of the Inquisition and the Crusades, both products of the Western world. Then, with the colonisation of the Americas by the Western world, there was the slave trade and the destruction of all those Native American cultures and ecologies that had flourished there for some 20,000 years. Could this not also be a cause of self-hatred of the Western world? Returning to my own story, my study of science led to my rejection of my religious studies as anachronism and archaic and of little relevance in the modern Western world, where science had all the answers that religion was once considered to have. Then, as a young chemical engineer, I had a serious industrial accident where I inhaled toxic gases, which led to my stay in hospital for a week under observation. This is when I seriously began to question the Western world I grew up in and had embraced so fully. By becoming a chemical engineer, I had lost connection to nature, to my spirituality and creativity. The factory I was working in was responsible for polluting Botany Bay, the most polluted waterway in Australia. This I knew because the engineers and managers I worked with were totally irresponsible about pollution produced by the factory. As someone who loved nature, especially the water of the ocean and the beach, this was of some concern. But when it was my own body that suffered from the pollution through the inhaling of these gases, this was serious. It was at that point in my life that I decided to embark on a career as a filmmaker. As I love film, another product of the Western world, so I decided to go to a film school in Melbourne. Well, it turned out that the film industry was just as profit-driven as the chemical industry, and was not really interested in the kind of film poetry and film music that I wanted to create. I went from film to theatre to bookshops and back to university to study the arts. Eventually, after several other degrees, I did my doctorate in social ecology. This is where I am now. So one last story of my journey that really influenced my self-hatred as a product of the Western world was when, as a young filmmaker, I decided to make a film about Aboriginal people living at La Perouse. Now, at that stage, I had some 17 years of formal education, which included what was supposed to be some of the top educational institutions in the state. And yet I knew nothing about these people except the racist views that they drank alcohol, were lazy, had weird things like boomerangs, dreamtime stories, and went walkabout. At that stage I knew they were here before British colonisation, and that many had suffered from having no immunity to the British diseases that the colonists brought to this country. I remember seeing an Aboriginal man selling boomerangs and other artefacts at La Perouse, so that's where I chose to begin my research. I went to the area where they lived to discover a shanty town, worthy of any third world or so-called developing country. I was deeply shocked. How could this be in the same city that I'd grown up with my middle-class modern world, just a few kilometres away? Here was this great product of the Western world, the city of Sydney, the biggest and one of the wealthiest cities of Australia, and yet its own Indigenous people, who I later learnt were the rightful owners of this land, were living in dire poverty. As a refugee child of Holocaust survivors, this was totally unacceptable. I had been led to believe this country valued equality, justice and democracy. and here were the original owners of this land left to live in squalor. I felt an enormous guilt and felt betrayed by the theoretical values of the Western world, which were not what was being practiced here. This reinforced my experience of studying chemical engineering. Because science was going to save humanity, that's why I studied it, only to discover that the chemical industry was an environmental vandal that was destroying the natural world with its pollution, as well as the way raw materials are extracted from nature. It seemed that I had discovered the Third World War that is being waged by the Western world against nature, as well as the war within the Western world between the sciences and the arts, that I experienced directly, until I made peace between them within myself by studying both sides of this conflict. In my studies of the arts, I discovered that my questioning of the benefits of the Industrial Revolution was the inspiration of romantic poets and artists like William Blake, who wrote about dark satanic mills, and Percy Shelley, who wrote of Ozymandias, King of Kings, his empire just a few lumps of stone in the desert, written as a warning of what happened to all the great civilizations of the Western world. William Irwin Thompson, the cultural historian, in his book Transforming History, writes about what he calls the four cultural ecologies of the West. The first was the riverine, Mesopotamia, that could no longer continue due to the salination caused by the irrigation system of agriculture around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The second was the Mediterranean, the Greco-Roman civilization, the basis of the Western world, that stripped its countryside of forest to build its ships. The third was the Atlantic cultural ecology of Western Europe and North America, that is now in serious decline because of industrial pollution, materialism, and irresponsible exploitation of natural resources. Through globalization, this pollution has been spread to the rest of the world as the Western world has exported its technology and industry to countries where labour is cheap and unions are banned. Once again, we see a possible cause of self-hatred here. On the one hand, the concerns of social justice and democracy that the Western world supports has led to unions being formed to protect the workers from the exploitation of the owners of the means of production. On the other, we have the same owners taking their factories to places where both pollution and exploitation of labour will not be challenged. These practices, which by maximising the profits of the rich, has led to the ever greater split between the rich and the poor of the contemporary world. The export of industrial agriculture has also led to serious deforestation and species extinction, and above all to climate change. Could this not be another cause of self-hatred in the Western world? This issue is raised in a recent report by the Royal Society of London. And I'm quoting from that report, there are very strong indications that the current rate of species extinction far exceeds anything in the fossil record. Never before has a single species driven such profound changes to the habitats, compositions, and climate of the planet. This very situation threatens the very survival of humanity. Once again, we can see the kind of hatred of the Western world that I developed as an individual product of that world could well be the source of a generalised self-hatred of the world that can produce so much good and yet allow it to be used to perpetrate so much evil. Here we have the echoes of the way that Christianity, the dominant religion of the Western world, was conceived as a religion of love, of compassion and peace, and yet has been used to perpetrate so many wars by people who identified as Christians throughout history. No doubt it was such observations that led to many books and films in the 20th century that document this self-hatred. One of the more influential of these was Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, written in 1911. According to Spengler, the Western world is ending and we are witnessing the last season, wintertime, of the Faustian civilization. In Spengler's depiction of Western man is a proud but tragic figure. Because he strives and creates, he secretly knows that the actual goal will never be reached. Two other books of great influence that document the self-hatred are Brave New World in 1984, written in response to what Aldous Huxley and George Orwell were witnessing as the decline of the West. This decline of the West led the cultural philosopher Jean Gebser to write his deeply insightful book, The Ever-Present Origins. In this book, Gebser describes or ascribes this self-hatred of the Western world to what he called a deficient form of the mental consciousness. This was the fourth structure of consciousness that humanity has passed through since its origins. He considered the mental consciousness began in the European Renaissance and ends with the Industrial Revolution, 2 destructive world wars, the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, and finally the exporting of the Western industrial model to the rest of the planet. Once again we can see here a major cause of self-hatred of the Western world. For all the art, culture, science and technology that the Western world has produced since the Renaissance and the European Enlightenment, we now witness a world on the brink of destruction as a result of that very mental consciousness. That Cartesian Newtonian paradigm that produced the single vision of Newton's sleep that Blake writes about, that considered the universe to be nothing but a giant clock ticking away to its entropic end. In Australia, a cultural product of the colonial expansion of that world in the 18th century, the time of the Industrial Revolution, we have witnessed 100 years of black wars, largely undocumented. This was along with a well-documented continuation of the 500-year war between English Protestants and Irish Catholics for the first 150 years of British colonisation by historians like Manning Clark. This brings to mind the response of the great non-violent activist Mahatma Gandhi. On a visit to Britain to talk to the workers of the cotton mills of Manchester to explain why the Indians were now producing their own cotton products, he was asked by a journalist, "Well, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of British civilization?" To which he replied, "I think it would be a very good idea." This brings me to the last part of my talk, where I will revisit the idea of an ecology of culture in Australia. As I see this as the point at which my own rejections of Western values began to shift. As I mentioned before, in Australia we have the cultural project of the Aboriginal people for some 40 to 60,000 years, the longest continuous culture on the planet. Then we've had some 200 years of British colonial culture brought here in 1788, with the first settlers or invaders, depending on whose perception of history we are considering. Then in the post-war period, we have the rise of the multicultural project, the World War II, of course, which became official in the 1970s under the government of Gough Whitlam. This was followed by the recognition by the Keating government that we are geographically in the Asia-Pacific region. Around the same time, we have the recognition of native title because of the determined work of the Torres Strait Islander activist Eddie Maubo, which finally laid to rest the legal fiction of terra nullius. Again, this is a reminder that till 1967, the original owners of this land were not included in the census, but considered part of the fauna and flora. Could this hypocrisy not also be a cause of self-hatred in the Western world that created a nation on the basis of this racist myth? Not to mention the inclusion of the White Australia policy as part of its first laws as an independent sovereign nation. However, I want to end on a more positive note. My own self-hatred of the Western world began to shift through my research in social ecology. When I came to realise that what we needed was an ecology of culture in Australia that included all the 3 cultural ecologies of the Aboriginal Cultural Project, the British Colonial Project, and the Multicultural Project. Such an ecology of culture also recognises the ecology of this land, a large arid island in the South Pacific, with a very delicate ecosystem and our geographic position in the Asia-Pacific region. This inclusive ecology of culture would allow us to live here in a more sustainable way, both culturally and ecologically. And this would address this very self-hatred as part of our long human history of some 60,000 years. Such a position resonates with the work of William Irwin Thompson, who I mentioned above, who sees the contemporary world as a time for the 4th cultural ecology of the West, the Pacific Aerospace Cultural Ecology, of which Australia is very much a part. It also acknowledges the possibility of the integral consciousness that John Gebser considered the next stage after the mental consciousness to come into being as we bring the Western, Eastern and Indigenous cultures into some kind of harmonious relationship in Australia, thus allowing the self-hatred of the Western world to turn to the self-love of a truly global world of one people and one planet. Thank you.
I'm going to attempt two things, and I think I'll fail on both counts, but I'll attempt. The first will be to demonstrate the plausibility of the claim that influential elements of Western elites are hostile to Western peoples, and that's theoretically what really interests me. That the political class, the cultural elite and so on, elements of them, really hate us.
Yes.
Really hate us. So I was drawn by this topic.
Yep.
I'll attempt to establish that. I won't succeed, but I'll show you the direction that I'm going in that attempting to prove it. And secondly, I'll suggest some causes, both proximate and long range.